So I'd like to go back to the 2010 research document, and actually, could I have this marked as an exhibit just for reference?
Exhibit number 352.
If I can ask you to turn to page 44, which I think is 48 in the ringtail numbers. Sorry, 50. Apparently I can't count. This table sets out, and let me just back up for a minute. You did a table that sets out the results of your model runs for each of the 3 cases, correct?
Yes.
So I'm just going to, in the interest of time, go to case 2. I understand case 2 is what was ultimately recommended for the 2010 forecast. Is that right?
Yes, I'll just elaborate on that. It was the CSAP salmon subcommittee had put that forward as the forecast with the greatest weight of evidence, the most plausible forecast. So case 2 was, in light of recent low productivity, put forward as the most plausible. However, the first and the third case were still considered within the realm of possibility. We just had the greatest weight of evidence put forward for case 2.
Okay, so with that in mind, I think I'll just focus on case 2 for today's hearing, just to review it. So this document, or this page of the document, I should say, sets out your forecast results using that recent productivity analysis that you described earlier.
That's correct.
Okay. And again, on column A, it sets out all the different stocks within the run timing groups, including the miscellaneous stocks.
Yes.
And then the next column B, this sets out the different models that you use to create the forecast, the ones that were most appropriate for those stocks.
That's correct.
All right. And then what do the tables C, D, E, F, G, and with the nice colors, what does all that describe?
Those columns are setting the stage or providing background for the forecasts, and for the models being used, the Bridger escapement is a key input to a lot of the different models. And the Bridger escapement, so column C has BY and then in brackets 06, and then underneath EFS. And that's Bridger 2006 effective female spawners. So that's the predictor variable that we use in most models.
So if I can just stop you for a minute,
Yes.
those show the parent generation for the 4-year-old returns. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
That's correct. The parental females for the fish returning in 2010.
As 4-year-olds.
That's correct. Sorry.
And then the one beside it is the same, but is it for the 5-year-old numbers?
Yes.
Okay. And then what do the colors mean, yellow, red, and green?
Based on time series averages for each individual stock, we created a distribution and a distribution of brood year escapement, or in the case of columns E and F, a distribution of productivity in the last, productivity on the time series, and a distribution of returns. And we broke that into 3 categories, whether it was below average, which it would below the time series average, so we would color code it red. If the brood year escapement or the productivity or the returns are average, we'd color them yellow in this table, and if they're above average, they'd be colored green. So we're using this as a tool, a ground truthing tool, as well as a tool to give you an idea of how the returns are, what are driving the returns we would expect. So in this forecast scenario, because we're looking at recent productivity, we wanted to highlight in column C, in particular column C, which is the driver, that most of the brood year escapements for most of the stocks as a starting point for what we expect to see in the future was generally a lot of the stocks were yellow or green. So they were either average or above average in terms of their brood year escapements. So at the very starting point in the forecasting process, the number of parents that were around in most of the systems was actually average or above average. So things were good from that perspective, starting out. There were 4 stocks that were below average. So Bowron, Late Stewart, Quinnell weaver were 4 stocks that had below average brood year escapements. So they're starting out of the starting blocks a little bit behind everything else for those individual stocks, given their own individual long-term time series for escapements. So that's part of the story when you're generating a forecast. The other parts of the story, the 5-year-old component, the contribution of the 5-year-old parents, the parents that are producing 5-year-olds in 2010 are playing a very small role in this forecast, because we were assuming that productivity associated with these 5-year-olds is identical to the 4-year-olds that came back in 2009. So the lowest productivity on record for most stocks, because the 5-year-olds came from the same parents as the fish that returned in 2009, and they hit the ocean at the same time as those fish hit the ocean in 2009. So they experienced almost identical survival conditions. The only difference is they spent 1 additional year in the ocean. So we're making an assumption that these 5-year-olds, I put it there just as a gauge for how the 5-year-old contribution is doing, so in terms of red and green, but in a way, they're not playing a big role in the forecast, because the 5-year-olds are being forecast using the very low productivity that we saw in 2009, because we expect them to be hit similarly by that low productivity. So the 4-year-olds, column C, is really driving the total return as a predictor variable. Then in column E and F, so there's 3 key factors that determine how many fish you might expect to see. The first is, how many parents do you have? So that's the brood year escapement. How many parents are you starting out with? The second important variable is the age structure, which I just described. So what is that? How old are they when they return? So Fraser sockeye mostly are going to return as 4-year-olds, so we're really focused on column C. The third important thing is the survival. So if you know how many parents there are, and you know survival, you've got your answer. So what column E and F are describing are the recent productivities for Fraser sockeye. So the last 8 years, column E is productivity in the last 8 years, and F is productivity in the last 4 years. And again, we're color coding these productivities in the last 4 years and the last 8 years relative to the time series. And if the recent productivities are below average, they're colored red.
Just to ask you a question.
Yeah.
I'm trying to follow the 4 and 5 year.
Okay.
Do the models take into account that you mentioned 2009 as the lowest productivity year on record?
Yes.
Right. Do the models build into their calculation a factor for perhaps the 2009 year showing up in 2010, along with the 2010 expectation in terms of returns? So if there was some reason that we don't know of why there was a delay for more than the usual number of sockeye, in other words, they didn't come back in the 4-year span, but for some reason that we don't know, there was a cause for this delay, so that more came back along with what was expected for the 2010 year. So you get this, now, you know, at the bookend, we have an extreme low return with an extreme high return. How do the models adjust for those you talked about uncertainties earlier around environmental factors and so on.
Yep.
But just in terms of other kinds of factors that may be playing, do the models take any of that into account, or are they, as you say, giving a very low weight attached to the 5-year?
No, that's a really good question, and I'll explain in response to that. It's a very good question, because that was coming up in public spheres, scientific spheres, with the low returns in 2009. Was there the possibility that those 4-year-olds just delayed and were returning as 5-year-olds? With the forecasting process, we're using the past to predict the future. And in the past, and we did look at this intensively, we've never really seen that kind of response in the age 4 and 5 age structure. It's never been seen before, where there's a massive signal where you see a massive shift in age proportions. So generally speaking, for most Fraser sockeye stocks, the age 4 component makes up about 95% of the total age structure. And throughout time for most of those stocks, that age structure doesn't vary. If it does, it's very little. We've never seen on the time series for any stock, and I'll explain one exception after I finish this part, is that we've never seen a shift like that. So even though that was out there as a hypothesis, looking at our historical data, which is what we use to forecast and move forward into the future, we've never seen that kind of delay in the 5-year-olds that would create a surplus in the next generation. So what you're suggesting, or what your hypothesis would have been, would be we would expect, instead of the usual 85% in 2010 of age 4s, we might see 85% age 5s because they've all come back from the previous year. But because we use the past to predict the future, we've never seen that for the Fraser sockeye stocks, except for one exception, and I'll explain that. And we're using the past to predict the future. We wouldn't build that into the models. We would still use the classic age proportions that we've seen on the historical time series. So there's no, that would be an event that would be outside of our range of understanding, so we couldn't incorporate it into our models because we've never seen it before. So it's a hypothesis. If it came true, it would have been very interesting, and it would have added to our time series, and it would add more knowledge for future hypothesis building. But for the current year, we didn't have any evidence that that's occurred ever. Harrison, I'll just explain, is one interesting stock. You've probably heard about it already throughout the testimony. Harrison sockeye are 3- and 4-year-old fish, and they're unique because all other stocks spend an additional year in the freshwater after they emerge from the gravel. So they rear in a lake, and then after that year rearing in a lake, they migrate to the ocean. So they've got a longer freshwater life history, whereas Harrison sockeye, when they emerge from the gravel, they shortly after that emergence are migrating to the ocean. There's some research that shows that they rear in sloughs along the way, but not for very long. Harrison sockeye, as a result, have a different age structure. We call them 3 sub-1s, 4 sub-1s, because they only have that 1 year in the gravel. And in reference to your question about age structure, Harrison do fluctuate wildly from 1 year to the next, from 3-year-olds to 4-year-olds. So they're the only stock where we see that kind of fluctuation in age structure. And there's some linkage with Harrison delaying a bit more in the marine environment when pinks are out there as well. So a hypothesis could be that Harrison are out in the ocean the same time as pinks. They have a similar life history to pinks because pinks also migrate to the ocean right away. They don't rear in the freshwater. So they're presumably competing for the same food resources in the ocean. And because Harrison's competing with this large abundance of pink, and this is a hypothesis, not fact, but they could be competing for the same resources out there in pink years. And as a result, they need an extra year in the ocean before they can return. So in pink years, we do see a slight delay in migration on Harrison sockeye, meaning that in pink years, we do see a slightly greater 4-year-old proportion than 3-year-old proportion, because Harrison are 3- and 4-year-olds. But they're the only stock we've ever seen anything like that for evidence that their age structure dramatically shifts from 1 year to the next. So to answer your question, we haven't built that into the forecast because we've never seen it before. So that's an interesting hypothesis, and of course people were curious to see whether the age structure in 2010 was going to be flipped around, and that would have been really fascinating, but we didn't see that, and it does map onto what we've seen historically. We've never seen that kind of flip-flop in age structure delay.
So where in the model do I see the 5-year factor being considered?
The age proportions?
Right.
When we're generating the forecasts, so say I'll just start, say with the biological model, we'll take the brood year escapement. So we have a relationship between brood year escapement and recruitment. So say simply, we've got brood year escapement and recruitment, and then we've got sort of a model going through, and you draw up, so say your brood year escapement is 10,000 fish, and just putting it simply, say there was just a straight line, like a linear regression straight line, you just map up on your x-axis,
Oh, I see.
and you map across. So then you go, okay, there's 10,000 fish, that maps onto 20,000 recruits. And we use the word recruits to describe the number of fish that comes back from that parental generation. And those recruits include 4 and 5-year-olds. And so what we do is we take, that's why the two columns C and D are in there. We would take column C, so say for early Stewart, we would take the 15,900 in this, say this RS 4 year. This is recruits per spawner in the last 4 years multiplied by brood year escapement. We would multiply that brood year escapement in 2006 brood year, which leads to 4-year-olds. But what we're doing is we're generating a forecast for total recruits coming from those parents. So from 2006, 4 years later, there would be 4-year-olds coming out of that, and 5 years later, there would be 5-year-olds coming out of that. But we're just generating a forecast for the total 4 and 5-year-olds from that. And we only want the 4-year-old component from that. So we multiply the total recruits that we get from that brood year escapement by the proportion of 4-year-olds we see on the time series. So say for early Stewart, it's 85% 4-year-olds. We would take for brood year 06, 15,900. We would get a recruitment from that and multiply that by the proportion of 4-year-olds. That gives us the 4-year-old component of the forecast. And it's stock recruitment tables, you have to flip your mind around from returns and recruits. Because a parental generation, it's like your offspring will grow up. Some of their babies will be mature at 4 years, and some a year later at 5. So all the recruits coming from this brood year escapement are coming back in 2010 and also in 2011. But we only want the component that's coming back in 2010 from those parents. And then the 2005 brood year, flipping that a little bit, that brood year escapement's 51,000. What we would do is we'd multiply the 51,000 by recent productivity. That's now the year before the 2005 brood year. This parental generation would be producing again offspring in 4 years later and 5 years later. And because this is the 05 brood year, they would have produced 4-year-olds in 2000. The previous year in 2009, and they would produce 5-year-olds in 2010. So what we're doing is we're taking that brood year escapement, multiplying it by the productivity, and we'll get a total recruitment for those parents. Their kids came back 4 years and 5 years later, but we, in this case, only want the 5-year-olds coming back because the 4-year-olds came back in 2009. So we're multiplying that by the 5-year-old proportion, which would be the inverse of the 4-year-old component. So a small percentage, like around 20% of the total run, or the 20% of the total age proportion. So each of these brood years are producing offspring 4 and 5 years later, and we're taking that total and assigning only the 4-year-olds coming back and the 5-year-olds coming back, and then we add those two numbers together to get the total. And that's where the age proportion comes in.
Well, we continue to look at the table. It shows in H&I the mean run sizes for all cycles, and then for the 2010 cycle, what is that describing?
The mean run sizes place the forecast distribution in the perspective of what we've seen historically on average. There's column H is across all the cycles. So Fraser sockeye have they're 4-year-old fish. 85% of each stock is generally 4-year-olds. So we usually describe Fraser sockeye on using cycles. So it's not that they're completely independent of one another, but each 4-year cycle, since they come back in 4 years, is almost a unique population. So there's parents, their offspring come back 4 years and 4 years and 4 years, so they're forming their own perhaps productivity pattern or their own like cyclic abundance. There's some cycles that are more abundant than others. So we, in addition to looking at all the cycles, all years combined, we also look at the specific cycle that we're looking at. So, for example, late Shuswap in 2010, is dominant. It's on its dominant cycle, so that's once every 4 years, late Shuswap comes back at the largest abundances across all cycles. So that's why it's important to compare the forecast distribution to also the cycle average, which tells you specifically anything unique. Some stocks don't exhibit differences in cycle line abundances, and other stocks, late Shuswap is the key example, that comes back at much larger abundances once every 4 years. So those two are for reference to the forecast, so you can place the forecast in column J to N in the context of the cycle average, and then column I specifically is used to place column L, which is the 50% median probability level, in the context of how the 50% probability forecast is doing relative to average, which is the color-coded column G.
Okay. So in simple terms, all cycles means every single cycle without distinguishing on a cycle abundance basis, just what the mean is.
Yep.
And then 2010 cycle is looking at the 2010 year, 2006 year, 2002 year, and so on back in time, and looking at the means just on that cycle line.
That's correct.
And then columns J, K, L, M, N, these describe the different probabilities that you would expect running those models. And these are the probabilities that we were looking at previously on page 41 on your horizontal bar graphs, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Okay, then I think that's probably enough for me on that document. Probably enough for everybody on that document. It's a great document, but it's pretty dense. The contact, once that work had been done, you created a SAR document, which you described earlier. That's Exhibit 341 for the 2010 year. Okay. And as you had described just after the break, I had said to you, well, case number 2 is what was recommended, and you indicated that it was put forward. All 3 cases were put forward in the SAR, but the highest probability table or case study was 2, and that's given the most highlight in this document. If we turn to page 8, that sets out the table that we just reviewed, minus a couple of the columns. Do you think that there was value in performing these 3 different case studies using these different assumptions? Was that a useful exercise?
Yes, I would say that producing 3 different tables for our different assumptions about Fraser sockeye survival through to 2010 was a valuable exercise.
And why is that?
The 3 tables have been useful, particularly, they're useful for framing out the uncertainty in the forecasts, in the return in 2010 associated with our forecasts, both from, as I'd mentioned earlier, by presenting the probability distribution from the 10 to the 90% probability level. It's describing that uncertainty in the models, the process, the observation error, etc. within the models. But we're also presenting the uncertainty in these 3 tables regarding future survival. So whether we expect 2010 to return at recent productivity, aligned with recent productivity, long-term average, or whether we expect 2009 to repeat itself. The usefulness of the tables laid out this way, if we had just presented the recent productivity table or we just continued on with the long-term average productivity table, the advantage of these tables was to place the returns that we saw coming back on these as maps. So particularly with greater stock detail. So these SARs, particularly for the long-term average productivity, there was more detail for the individual stocks in the research document for 2010 versus what's in this table. We've simplified because this is a communication document and we were really putting forward the recent productivity forecast, but the research document is also used during fisheries planning processes, so they would have the greater detail as well. So when stocks are returning, it enables us to place on these maps where these stocks are falling out. So often we've heard a lot in the press, real focus on 50% probability levels, and they're being communicated often as deterministic single point estimates. But these forecasts are also actually describing the range of uncertainty we're seeing, both, as I'd mentioned, in process observation error as well as in different assumptions about future survival. So what they're used as, or what we can use them as, is a map to place the stocks as they're coming in onto these different these different assumptions about survival, and it gauges right away where we're at. So in the case of stocks, we had recommended, since we'd seen productivity in recent years had been quite low, we made assumptions that the greatest weight of evidence was that we'd expect to see that in the future. But what we started to see with the stocks as they were returning was, in fact, they were coming in closer to the long-term average than they were the recent average. So even though the greatest weight of evidence was on the recent productivity, we weren't saying that these other scenarios couldn't happen, because we actually don't have indicators telling us which of these scenarios could happen. We just felt that the immediate past would predict the future better than the historical time series. So as the runs started coming in, we started placing them on these maps, realizing that early Stewart was coming in greater. So that's the first run timing group to enter the Fraser watershed. And that group started coming in at the high end of the recent productivity scale. But when you place it on the long-term average productivity scale that uses the whole time series, not just the recent productivity, it started referencing where that stock is actually falling in reference to a long-term average. So that one roughly was coming in around 100,000. They're not final numbers yet, but you can see that it places it between the 25 and the 50% probability level on the long-term average productivity table. So it's actually closer to long-term average than it was recent productivity. That's the first stock to enter the Fraser watershed. Then there's overlap between all these 4 run timing groups, but it's starting to give an early sign that things might have been better throughout that life history of Fraser sockeye, from the egg stage all the way through to the adult return. There was some signs that early Stewart was coming back better than the low productivity we've seen in recent years. And as other runs started coming in, we don't necessarily have the detailed stock breakdown, but we have aggregates of stocks depending on how fine of a genetic analysis we're doing on the returns as they're coming in, because we don't get down specifically in season to specific stocks. But there were signs that particularly the Shuswap run was coming in much better than expected, and that's the early summer Shuswap run. So it's occupying some of the same habitat that the late Shuswap, which is the Adams run, which was the massive run in 2010. That run in the early summer component, we started seeing signals that was falling out high in the long-term average productivity table. There's a lot of nuances to the individual stocks, so often we do fixate on a single number, like the 2009 forecast. 10.6 million is a number that's used over and over again, but really you've got to focus on the nuances of the forecast tables amongst all the stocks and the probability distribution. And 2010, the value of these tables is being able to place the individual stock groupings you have as they're coming in right away onto a map that's telling you what productivity was like for the individual stocks. And we oversimplify it a lot. We'll say 2010 was a bonanza year, 2009 was a crappy year or a bad year. But there's actually nuances to the stocks that you can see within the forecast tables. So, for example, 2010 was really great for the Shuswap run stocks. So late Shuswap, which was the Adams, which we knew even from the start was going to drive the forecast. We hadn't seen productivity declines for it. So in fact, even in the recent productivity forecast, the forecast in the recent productivity versus a long-term average for late Shuswap wasn't too different, because we hadn't seen productivity declines for late Shuswap, which was the driver of the 2010 forecast. It's actually had very stable productivity over time relative to all the stocks that have been showing these declining trends. And so based on our recent knowledge as well as our historical knowledge for late Shuswap, we didn't expect to see a real drop in abundance for late Shuswap. We didn't expect to see lower productivity. And if you look at the two tables, especially in the research document for late Shuswap, you won't see a big difference between late Shuswap for the long-term average productivity table and late Shuswap for the recent productivity table. They both have very similar forecasts because we didn't see declines in productivity. So that was interesting about 2010 and these three tables, because late Shuswap, which again we expected to return at high abundances, it actually returned at really high abundances. It was, I believe they probably came out at the 90% or above the 90% probability level. So we're at the tails of the distribution. So they were actually, based on this kind of system of map, or just kind of placing them on the map of the three forecast tables, you could tell right away that early summer Shuswap were coming back at, on the long-term average, even above average. And but you could also see that other stocks, even early Stewart, because when we say 2010 was a gangbusters year, early Stewart actually didn't. It was better than recent productivity, but based on the long-term average, it was still below average. And there's other stocks that are below average. So it's important when we're looking at the forecast to really focus on the complexity of the forecast tables, not default to just a single number like 10.6 million. And these tables, the real benefit is that perspective, that even in season, scientists and people using the information in season to manage the fisheries could start switching their attention to the long-term average productivity table. They started seeing signals, and they had a table right in front of them that would say, if things are above average, now this is what we're looking at more than this recent productivity. And they could clearly say that we weren't experiencing what we saw in 2009. So we, fairly early on, I'm sure that was out of the realm. People were starting to think, okay, we're not going to see 2009 again. And then you started seeing that it is actually better than recent productivity, so it's more on the long term. But amongst all those stocks, there's still nuances, which is always important to keep in mind. The same for 2009. There's a lot of nuances to the returns. It's not, in 2009, almost every stock was bad, poor productivity, amongst the lowest on record. But Harrison was still an exception in 2009. So when you look at the full forecast table, you could see Harrison actually came in above average in terms of its productivity. And even within these probability levels, stocks aren't all coming in at the same kind of within their forecast distribution. So although we do a summation at the end, it's really important, especially for management purposes, I think as well, to make sure you focus on the stocks and the run timing groups. And it's a long answer to why those three tables are important.
Can the run size forecasts be updated after the SAR has been developed? Are changes made?
Changes can be made to the forecast all the way up to when they're being used. It's only it would be the best practice, which is what we do, that if new information comes to us or there's revisions that we need to make to the forecast, we can do it all the way up to when it's being used. So changes could be made to the forecast. The paper itself wouldn't change because it's a published document with a number associated with it, and it's published on the CSAS website, so that would never change. But there could be changes to the forecast itself. It's possible that you could make changes, and there would be processes if the forecast changed. I know we made a revision to the early Stewart forecast in 2009, I believe, and that revision came in light of new revisions to our escapement time series for the brood year. So the parental generation, there was a revision to the numbers from the data that we were using, and it had a big effect on the forecast. So we didn't, at the time actually, the forecast paper hadn't been put online, so we were able to make it within the document. But if the document had been published and that change occurred, we would still put that change through public channels and through processes. So the Fraser panel, for example, that deals with in-season management of Fraser sockeye would get an update as soon as we had that information available to update them on changes we've made to the forecast. So it's best practice to, if there is a change, we wouldn't sit on it and not inform the people who need to know to make management decisions.
This is a question I've asked a couple of other witnesses who've been here. There are uncertainties, as you've described, with preseason forecasts. And then there's differences between the preseason forecasts and what's observed in season. So given those uncertainties and the differences that are observed when the runs return, are these forecasts valuable? Or are they worth generating?
Well, when you say differences, we should clarify that there are, in most years, the returns fall within the forecast distribution. So they're not different. They're just falling within the forecast distribution at a different probability level.
Okay.
And your question was
Are they a useful thing to do, or are they providing useful information, or do they just create confusion? And it's because we certainly hear a lot of people stating that the forecasts are unreliable, that they're inaccurate. And is that a problem with the communication, or is that a problem with the forecasting information you're providing?
I would say it's a problem with communication. Even the terminology inaccurate is inaccurate. You wouldn't say the forecast is inaccurate. You would, the return is just falling within the probability distribution, lower or higher than the 50% probability level. But people are often fixated, especially because it is complicated. I can't remember all these numbers in this table, so it's much easier to remember 10.6 million than the complexity of this table. So the I know where I'm going, I just have to. So it becomes a problem with communication. There's a lot of wording that's used to describe the forecast, especially in light of 2009, where people are fixating on the 10.6 million number, and it's really oversimplifying the forecast as it's presented in terms of the probability distribution, the uncertainty we have associated with the forecast, and the fact that DFO never expects the 50% probability level to be what will return. That's a midpoint in the probability distribution, and we actually have a 1 in 2 chance that the run will come in above or below that actual value. So that value isn't a deterministic DFO expects 10.6 to come back. We actually expected a range from 3.6 to 36.6, or whatever the range was, roughly in that range, to come back, and that's our probability distribution. And we also say we expect, the forecasts are used to say, well, we expect a return to come back, say, at the 25% probability level. So I'm not sure if we just move back on the to the previous page for table 1. Thank you. The 10% probability level, say or the 25% probability level for early Stewart, say, is there's a 1 in 4 chance that we would expect that the return would come back at 26,000 or less, given the environmental conditions that this particular table is associated with. So, given recent productivity, we would expect that 26,000 fish would come back or less given recent productivity. So there's a lot of statements you're making when you're talking about the forecast. We're not saying DFO expects 11.4 million to come back. We're saying for early Stewart, there's a range of probabilities based on our range of experiences we've seen in the recent productivity, that under the assumption of recent productivity, we expect a 1 in 4 chance that it'll come back at 26,000 or less. A a 3 in 4 chance that it'll come back at 66,000 or less. So with the forecasts, it's those kind of words, when we're getting back to communication, it's been highly oversimplified in how it's been communicated broadly to the Canadian public, and how it's being picked up as a point estimate. And it's also being because it's a complex issue. It's very, like I said, memorizing this table, it might be humanly possible for some people, but most people not. So you tend to simplify and say, we expect 10.6. But this table is just describing we're always using the past to predict the future. And this assumption in table 1 is, given recent productivity, this is the range of returns we would expect to see if this productivity persisted into the future. So that's the first part of your question, is just explaining the communication disconnect in how the tables are actually quite complex. They are explaining the uncertainty given your assumptions. So in previous years, for 2009, we just had the long-term average table. That was the only table we were using. And in that, for a particular model, we would be saying we would expect a 1 in 2 chance that the run would come back at 10.6 million, given the environmental conditions we've seen on the historical time period. If environmental conditions go off what we've seen in that historical time period, then of course the forecasts, the return is actually going to come outside of the range of probabilities that we assign, because we've never seen it before. So the past is used to predict the future, and we're trying to communicate what the past is informing us in terms of the uncertainty with the forecasts and the nuances between the different stocks. So there has been a real oversimplification of the forecasts that have, and misuse of terms like inaccurate or completely wrong, or those kind of terms. The forecast is actually quite informative to tell you that right away, what we're seeing in 2009 is actually completely different from what we've ever seen historically. It is amongst the lowest productivity, or is the lowest productivity on record for a lot of stocks. So when something is outside of your historical range of understanding, you're not going to pick it up in these types of models, because they're forecasting the future based on what we've seen historically. So that's the communications part of your question. But the other part of your question is, are these useful? And I think that they are useful from multiple perspectives. I already described why they're useful from the perspective of placing returns in the context of the forecast. And I think in the case of 2009, it was a very useful tool, and unfortunately, the message that got out was a little backwards. It was all this people being upset that the forecasts were wrong. And in fact, what the message is that based on our historical understanding of Fraser's sockeye population dynamics, 2009 was very strange. We'd never seen it before. So the real message, unfortunately, got missed a little bit with how it was being communicated, and it should have been, wow, something really exceptional happened in 2009, because it's falling at the extreme end of our probability distribution. So there was something like a 1 in 100th chance that we would have seen that total return, given our range of understanding of Fraser sockeye stocks. So that's the communication issue, and the usefulness of the forecast is to do that, to place the returns that we see in the context of what we've historically seen. So 2009, we saw 1.3 million. We could place it on that range where we said 3.6, the range at, using current probability levels, we'd say at the 10% probability level, we expected 3.6, all the way up to the 90% probability level where we expected something like 37.6. And in fact, the run came in below the 10% probability level at 1.3. So right away, we're getting a signal that what we're seeing is outside of our historical range of understanding. And then when we started postseason looking at productivity data, you start recognizing that for a lot of stocks, the productivity was amongst the lowest on the record for the time series, or was the lowest for most stocks, not Harrison. Harrison was, for 2009, returned at reasonable abundance, a good abundance. But that's, again, the nuances of the data, and not all stocks' productivity was the lowest on record. So there's a lot of variation in the data. So the forecasts are useful from that perspective, placing the returns in the perspective of what have we seen historically. They're also useful, they're the best we have as a tool for preseason and early in-season management. These models are, through the retrospective analysis process, are the best performing models that we have currently available to forecast Fraser sockeye returns, and they do characterize the uncertainty as well as characterize the uncertainty of what we might expect to see given assumptions. So in previous years' forecasts, we only had the long-term average productivity table, so our assumptions were always, this is the probability distribution we expect to see given productivities are similar to long-term average. If they're outside of that, then they're going to be outside of what we've seen historically. So for preseason planning, early in-season, for early in-season run size models, I know they use the preseason forecasts as a tool to help as a starting point for what we're seeing, what we expect to see. As in-season data becomes more and more available, these preseason forecasts start dropping off in terms of their usefulness as inputs into the model, but they're still useful from a qualitative perspective to place you on the map as to where you are. And as I'd mentioned, they are amongst the best models globally. Especially this past year, we were using models like the Kalman filter Ricker model, which are very few people globally would use that model. It's very current and up to speed on very recent methodology that Dr. Peterman was developing in regards to picking up recent productivity trends. So in our recent productivity table, we try to stay sort of ahead with new models and new methods. So, and then we do the retrospective analysis to pick the best models. So they are our best starting point. They're better than just pulling a number out of the air or making a rough guess as to what you think might be coming next year. So those are the two benefits. And there's one more, just from a purely scientific biological perspective. Biologists and scientists are always playing around with models in the perspective of forecasting and understanding how it describes the current state of understanding about population dynamics for an organism. So for Fraser sockeye, we have a bunch of models, and these all in different ways describe our understanding of population dynamics for that model. And every year we're reevaluating our assumptions about how well we understand this animal and evolving and trying out new modeling techniques. And it's not just within this this world that's input into management, but scientists are developing models. So you'll see in State of the Ocean reports published by DFO, but that includes scientists throughout the world, I'd say largely US, Canada, who are publishing different forecasts for different salmonids or different stocks. And they're all playing around with different hypotheses for what is influencing Fraser sockeye survival. So models, in a way, are exploring hypotheses for Fraser sockeye survival. So biologically, scientifically, they're a useful tool for describing our current state of understanding of survival, exploring, and adapting and evolving. So those are the three key reasons why forecasts are important.
Dr. Beamish of DFO Science has done work recently in the marine environment in the Strait of Georgia, looking at juveniles in the Strait of Georgia. Have you considered whether his work or other similar marine studies could be used in forecasting?
Yes. We quantitatively have used a variety of variables in the models, which I described earlier. So in the biological models, we can use a variety of environmental variables. And this is going to segue into your question, but it sets the stage for it. Quantitatively, we tried sea surface temperature, we've tried Fraser discharge, different individual variables, and they generally haven't improved the forecast. They do little tweaks to the forecast, but they don't give us the answer. They aren't the solution to explain all the variability in the stock recruitment relationship so that we perfectly can predict Fraser sockeye using sea surface temperature. In fact, they only tweak it minorly, and it only tweaks it for some stocks in some years. But we haven't found a single environmental variable. And likely the reason for that is that Fraser sockeye have such a complex life history that they, from their individual rearing lake, where they're in the gravel, there can be environmental conditions in the gravel, flood events that scour the eggs, all the way downstream. During their downstream migration, there can be mortality, especially as they're transitioning into the ocean. There can be mortality. They hit the Strait of Georgia, there can be mortality. They migrate fast along the continental shelf and out into the North Pacific, and then they're mingling around there for another year before they return. So it's this huge, massive spatial temporal scale on which we're trying to understand what is driving survival. So in our models, when we're quantitatively trying to put in environmental variables like sea surface temperature, it's only one spot, and it's in their whole life history that covers freshwater all the way to marine. And it's asking a lot of a sea surface temperature variable that does try to incorporate. Sea surface temperature isn't just the temperature alone, but it's often influencing different zooplankton compositions, different food quality for the fish, or just the temperature itself. So it is trying to integrate a number of variables into a single one. But at the same time, it probably is oversimplifying or not quite capturing the problem, because it's in time and space. You could measure sea surface temperature, but maybe you're not measuring it in the right spot at the right time, or maybe it's synthesized over a broad space, so that it's so complex to just take individual variables and look at it quantitatively. So that's why there's been a lot of challenges trying to find the one variable or a couple of variables or a composite of variables that work quantitatively. So it's a big question with Fraser sockeye. Other salmonids that have been forecast have better success with incorporating environmental variables. So for example, on the west coast of Vancouver Island, there'll be coho stocks that migrate out and they stay local on the coast of Vancouver Island. So unlike Fraser sockeye, these animals are in the freshwater, so there's that element of uncertainty in their survival, but then they're hitting the ocean and staying very local. So you can do very strategic sampling in time and space, because you know where they are. You can even sample the animal because they're right off the coast, and you know they're going to stay there for their whole marine distribution. And I know that there's certain individuals like Dr. Ron Tanasichuk has been doing some forecasting quite successfully, because he's working on stocks that you have a better handle on where they are. Their ocean distribution is a lot more localized versus Fraser sockeye that are hitting the Strait of Georgia and very rapidly, except for Harrison, that's unique again, but all the other stocks are hitting the Strait of Georgia. And generally from research data from Dick Beamish and Mark Trudell, who do the high seas salmon, and Dr. Mark Trudell does high seas salmon, and Dr. Dick Beamish does the Strait of Georgia, they've been finding they migrate rapidly through the Strait of Georgia. They migrate along the continental shelf out through the Aleutians, and then they're hanging out in the North Pacific. So there's through time and space, they're covering a big geographic area. So I'm just pointing out the complexity of their life history and why those individual variables haven't worked very well. So in segueing into 2009, and recognizing that individual variables aren't working well, we did look at a report card, and we could refer to that now if we wanted to. It's a qualitative way of describing a range of indicators for Fraser sockeye. So rather than just looking at sea surface temperature in entrance island off the coast of Nanaimo. We've integrated a bunch of these different variables in a report card, which is commonly used. It's being used by the U.S. government as well, doing report cards on environmental variables that you think will influence sockeye or the animal that you're studying survival. So we qualitatively looked at that. I can explain it in the 2009 report on page 16.
Ms. Baker,
Okay.
I think we will take a lunch break.
Okay.
Okay.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.